So good afternoon and a warm welcome to everyone joining us today for this evening's webinar with Connor Keating. I'm Brian, Comms and Engagement here at Cray. Here at the Centre for Research in Autism and Education, we are a team of autistic and non-autistic staff and students based within the UCL Institute of Education and part of the Department of Psychology and Human Development. Through everything we do at Cray, we take a participatory approach, which means we work with autistic folk in all stages of our research and initiatives, from initial design right through to the sharing of the outcomes. We hope that this means that the work we do is meaningful for the wider autistic community. So we aim to conduct high quality cutting edge research, but also to ensure that the results of that research reach those who stand to benefit from them. This Cray webinar series is a part of that, allowing people to hear from some of the key researchers, practitioners and advocates in the field. At this point, I'd like to say a big thank you to our funders, supporters and team members who contribute to our work and make it all possible. In particular, a special thank you to Pears Foundation for their generous ongoing support that underpins everything that we do. As always, we invite you to become part of this conversation either in the chat or with more anonymity in the Q&As. We'll stop recording at that point and we'll endeavour to have as many questions answered as we can by Connor. Today, we are so lucky to have the brilliant Connor Keating with us. Dr. Connor Keating is a junior research fellow and an experimental psychologist at the University of Oxford. He is also the co-director of the U21 Autism Research Network, a global collaboration of researchers and community members across 14 countries dedicated to addressing issues around diversity and inclusion in autism research. Connor, you are very welcome to join us. It is now all over to you.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Can everyone see my screen? Hopefully.
Can, yes.
Perfect. Amazing. So yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really delighted to be here today to be talking about some of the work I conducted during my PhD at the University of Birmingham and then subsequently continued at the University of Oxford as part of a fellowship. And that is mostly going to centre on emotion processing in autistic and non-autistic people. So to start out, I first want to talk a bit about how autism has been conceptualised historically. And this is not because I necessarily agree with this conceptualisation, but rather because I think it's quite useful for setting the scene on what current understanding was when I sort of first learnt about autism and came into this area. So during my undergraduate degree, I was taught that there was this triad of characteristics associated with autism. So there were so-called difficulties with behavioural flexibility, difficulties with language and communication, and difficulties with social interaction. And within these kind of latter two areas, there were also said to be difficulties in various different emotion-related domains. So there are said to be difficulties with understanding emotion, with expressing emotion, with reading other people's emotion, and with empathy. Now, after learning about this during my undergraduate degree, I was actually really skeptical about this idea. And I was skeptical for lots of different reasons, which we'll hear about in the talk today. But one of those reasons was that it was completely different to my own experiences. So the autistic people that I'd interacted with, both through volunteering or in my personal life with friends, were extremely empathetic and really able to read my emotions. In fact, my autistic friends, for example, were almost so empathetic that they'd even go as far to catch my emotions and go through things in my life with me at the same time. And so this really stood at odds with what I was learning during my undergraduate degree. So this made me really interested in trying to understand this and research this a bit further. So I turned to the academic research and read various different systematic reviews on these topics. And generally the message that was coming out of these systematic reviews was that autistic people may have difficulties recognizing the emotions of other people, and they may have kind of difficulties with empathy. But something that was very clear from this academic research was that the evidence was so mixed. So in some studies, they were showing that there were differences, and in others, they were showing no differences. And so it wasn't very clear what the picture was from those. When we turn to the sort of literature that's out there from autistic self-advocates, we actually see the opposite kind of message. We see that these people are saying that they are highly empathetic, they can read other people's emotions, and sort of corroborating what I've experienced with my own friends, some other people are also saying that they even catch the emotions of other people and experience them very intensely. So overall, the kind of main message here is that there's a very mixed picture out there online. Some academic research is suggesting that there may be difficulties in these emotion processing domains, while my personal experiences and autistic self-advocates are sort of saying the opposite. So one theory that's really helped to clean up this kind of mixed literature and mixed picture is the alexithymia hypothesis. So alexithymia is a subclinical condition characterized by difficulties identifying and describing one's own emotions. And while in the non-autistic population, 5% of people have co-occurring alexithymia, 50% of the autistic population have co-occurring alexithymia. And this has led to the proposition of the alexithymia hypothesis, which is the idea that alexithymia and not autism is responsible for difficulties with emotion processing. So the argument here is that some autistic people may show difficulties with emotion processing, but this is because of underlying alexithymia. And similarly, some non-autistic people will show difficulties with emotion processing, and again, this probably stems from alexithymia. And critically, when we're thinking about emotion processing, these differences could manifest through a number of different domains. So this could be in empathy, in emotion recognition, in emotion expression, in the way in which someone conceptualizes or visualizes emotion, perhaps. So around the time that this hypothesis was proposed, there was then a stream of studies that sort of gave support for the hypothesis. So there were a number of different studies that suggested that alexithymia and not autism was linked to difficulties with emotion recognition for static expressions, that alexithymia and not autism was linked to lower empathy, and also to reduce time spent looking at the eye region of the face of emotional facial expressions, for example. So together, the sort of picture that was emerging is actually these kind of emotion processing differences in autism actually pertain to alexithymia and not actually autism. But what's really striking is in the autism literature, we also see that there are loads of other studies that have been suggesting that autistic people may have difficulties in other emotion processing domains where they haven't accounted for alexithymia. So, for example, there have been studies suggesting that autistic individuals have difficulties differentiating their own emotional states and difficulties differentiating the meaning of different emotions. There have been suggestions that autistic and non-autistic people produce different emotional facial expressions, and that these groups may picture angry, happy, and sad expressions quite differently in their mind's eye. But again, none of these studies have actually considered the role of alexithymia, and therefore it's not clear whether these differences would still remain if we controlled for this factor. And so this made me really interested when I was coming into this area in trying to work out how much this alexithymia hypothesis could explain. So is it the case that differences in emotion processing across all domains are linked to alexithymia rather than autism? And does this extend into the way that we kind of experience, define, visualize, and express emotion? And so this will be the first research question that I'll be tackling today. But before I do that, I want to tell you a bit more about why I was skeptical about the idea that autistic people have difficulties recognizing the emotions of other people. Well, I was skeptical because largely this evidence was based on studies in which autistic and non-autistic observers had to recognize non-autistic facial expressions. Now, given that I've just said that there's a body of evidence suggesting that autistic and non-autistic people produce different facial expressions of emotion, it could be that the autistic participants struggle to recognize the non-autistic facial expressions simply because these are dissimilar to what they would themselves adopt. And similarly, we might then expect non-autistic people to have difficulties recognizing autistic facial expressions, again due to this mismatch. But unfortunately, the vast majority of these studies hadn't actually looked at how well autistic and non-autistic people could also recognize autistic facial expressions. So this sort of idea chimes with the double empathy problem, which asserts that difficulties in communication and understanding between autistic and non-autistic people are bidirectional rather than being one-sided. So drawing on these ideas, I became really interested in whether the way that we express emotion might then contribute to emotion recognition differences. And then extrapolating that, I became very interested in whether the way that we also experience, conceptualize, and visualize emotion might also contribute to individual differences in emotion recognition. So in other words, I wanted to answer the question of what factors might make it easier or harder for autistic and non-autistic people to read each other's emotions, read other people's emotions. And so this is the second research question which we'll be talking about today. So to start answering these questions, I first wanted to focus on whether there were differences in the way that autistic and non-autistic people experience and define emotion after controlling for alexithymia, and then to assess whether there were differences in the way that these groups visualize and express emotion after controlling for alexithymia. So I'm going to go through them today in that order, and each time that I touch on one of those topics, I'm then going to talk about whether individual differences in the way that people experience, define, visualize, or express emotion might be linked to individual differences in emotion recognition too. So there's quite a lot to get through, so let's start first of all with these two topics. So on the screen, you're seeing the two research questions that I've already set out. So I'm just going to recap what the research knowledge was at the state when I was doing my PhD. So there were suggestions that autistic people have difficulties differentiating between their own experiences of and the meaning of different emotions. And again, this study hadn't controlled for alexithymia, so we wanted to make sure we were doing that in our investigation. In terms of whether there was a link between individual differences in the experience of emotion and the recognition of emotion, there is some evidence to suggest that higher emotion differentiation is linked to higher emotion recognition performance. So it does seem plausible that there could be a link in our study too. So on to the first project. So in this project, we had two research questions. We wanted to work out whether there were differences in the precision and differentiation of one's own emotional experiences between autistic and non-autistic adults after controlling for alexithymia. And then we wanted to determine whether individual differences in this domain contributed to emotion recognition differences. And so we had autistic and non-autistic adults complete two short tasks which were developed with input from autism community members. So in the first of these tasks, which is our EmoMap paradigm, on each trial, participants viewed pairs of images, each known to selectively induce either anger, happiness, or sadness across large samples, and then they were asked to rate how similar the emotions evoked by the images are. So, for example, if I were to do this trial, I would say that these two images evoke very similar emotions in me, and thus give a high similarity rating. What we can then do is transform this similarity rating into a distance score using multi-dimensional scaling, and then we can plot it. So essentially, each of the dots on this map correspond to one of the images that they were asked to evaluate. So because I've given a high similarity rating to these two images, they would be very close together in that space. Once we've plotted that multi-dimensional scaling map, we can then calculate the distances between those emotion clusters, which tells us how well someone can distinguish more different emotional states, and also the distances within those emotion clusters, which tells us how well someone can make more fine-grained distinctions between more similar emotional states, like sadness, sorrow, and despair, for example. In our second task, the emotional precision task, participants saw emotional stimuli again, but this time had to say which image made them feel more angry, happy, or sad. And we calculated emotional precision based on the logical consistency of decision making. So let me illustrate what I mean by that. So here we have a consistent emotional response. The first image makes them feel more happy than the second image. The second image makes them feel more happy than the third image. And so too does the first image make them more happy than the third image. All of this is consistent. However, if someone were to say that the first image makes them more happy than the second image makes them more happy than the third, but then that the third image makes them more happy than the first, then this would be inconsistent with their previous decisions and it would count against them in their precision score. Bit of a tongue twister there. So precision is requiring participants to differentiate between the intensity of emotion evoked by each of those images, and thus inconsistent decisions are likely to stem from inconsistencies in the way in which someone is experiencing emotion across multiple instances. But what did we find? So here we identified that after controlling for alexithymia, there were no differences between the autistic and non-autistic adults in the precision and differentiation of their emotional experiences. Instead, we identified that participants could be broadly classified into having these two different types of maps. So there were some participants, like participant A, that had this lovely modular structure in which their emotional experiences were precise and distinct. Whereas there were others, like participant B, that had much more variable and overlapping emotional experiences. And we demonstrated in our study that those high in alexithymia tended to have these maps that are more like the one on the right, so more variable and overlapping. We also demonstrated that those high in alexithymia tended to have smaller distances both between and also within those emotion clusters in those maps, suggesting these individuals had difficulties differentiating both more distinct and more similar emotional states. So overall here, we're finding evidence to suggest that the alexithymia hypothesis does extend into this domain of emotional experiences. Alexithymia and not autism is linked to less precise and less well differentiated emotional experiences. But as you'll remember, there was a second research question to consider. So do individual differences in this experience domain contribute to emotion recognition differences? Well, to answer that question, we had to get our participants to do an emotion recognition task. And so we had participants view a point light display of an angry, happy, or sad facial expression on each trial. And then they were required to rate how angry, happy, and sad that expression appeared on 3 scales. And we calculated emotion recognition accuracy as the correct emotion rating minus the mean of the 2 incorrect emotion ratings. But what did we find? So is the precision and differentiation of emotional experiences linked to emotion recognition? Well, this actually depended on the group that we were looking at. So for the non-autistic participants who are shown in green on these plots, having a better ability to distinguish between both more distinct and more similar emotional states was linked to higher emotion recognition performance, but this was not the case for the autistic participants, which are shown in orange here. So here we're finding some early evidence to suggest that there may be some slight differences in the mechanisms involved in emotion recognition for each of these groups. So now I'm going to move on to talk about emotion definitions. So again, just to recap, previous research had said that autistic people make less fine-grained distinctions between the meaning of different emotions, but again, they hadn't controlled for alexithymia in this investigation. Now, in terms of the second question of whether individual differences in how someone defines emotion might contribute to emotion recognition, there wasn't really much literature out there at the time to speak to this. But if you think about it, it's quite logical and plausible that there would be a link here. So if we imagine that someone has a really precise and well-differentiated emotion dictionary, perhaps they define frustration as a form of annoyance resulting from an unfulfilled need or want, and irritation as annoyance resulting from a repeated unpleasant event or stimulus. Here, the person is really carefully carving out the boundary between those two different emotions, here in terms of context. And so you can imagine how this might help them to then recognize other people's emotional facial expressions, again, based on context, for example. So if I could see that someone was looking quite angry and there was a bee buzzing around them that just wouldn't leave them alone, I'd be able to say that they're probably feeling irritated based on that context. Similarly, if someone was holding the same expression, but perhaps I just found out that they didn't get into their university of choice, I might think that's more frustration because they're not being able to fulfill that want. Whereas if someone just conflates all of these terms and says that frustration, irritation, and annoyance are all just the same thing, then you can imagine that they might find it then difficult to work out when they or when other people are feeling those different emotions. So as part of this project, we wanted to answer 2 research questions again. So we wanted to work out whether there were differences in the precision and differentiation of emotion definitions between autistic and non-autistic adults after controlling for alexithymia, and then to work out whether individual differences in this domain contribute to emotion recognition differences. So we had autistic and non-autistic adults again complete our emotional vocabulary test, which again was developed with input from autism community members. And so in this test, participants have to define 20 different emotion terms which come up on screen one at a time, and they do this by typing. And we had various different checks to make sure people weren't cheating by just copy and pasting a dictionary from Google or from Oxford or Cambridge, for example. And anyway, there weren't any cheats, which was great to see. And so we then calculated the precision of those emotion definitions, a bit like how you'd score an intelligence test like the WASI. So a score of 0 was given for an incomplete or completely incorrect definition. A score was given of 1 if it was kind of partially there, so it had some of the information, but not all of the information required to get 2 points, and then 2 points was given for a fully complete and relevant response. So to sort of exemplify this, we had some participants say for the emotion loneliness, the feeling of being alone. Well, this is capturing one component of loneliness, right? The context in which it arises, but it's not really capturing that traditionally this is a kind of a negative emotion that feels quite sad. And so they would only get 1 point for that because their definition could also pertain to the psychological state of feeling independent, for example. We also scored the distance between emotion definitions. And the way that we did this is we fed those definitions into a natural language processor, which computes the similarity in meaning of pairs of definitions. So let me explain what I mean by that. So essentially it takes your definition for angry, let's say, and your definition for happy. It works out what the meaning is of those two different definitions, and then it compares the meaning and gives a similarity score ranging from 0, not similar at all, to 1, identical in meaning. And then what we did is we inverted those scores to get semantic distance scores just to facilitate our interpretation. So we wanted to be sure that this was working properly. So we had a look at which pairs of definitions had the lowest semantic distance scores. And if our pipeline is working, the ones with the lowest semantic distance scores should be emotions that we think are very highly related. And they were. So they were anxiety and fear, depression and sadness, contentment and peaceful, contentment and happiness, and anger and irritation. So that was great to see as a good check. But what did we find in terms of autism and alexithymia? Well, similar to last time, we also identified that after controlling for alexithymia, there were no differences between the autistic and non-autistic adults in the precision or differentiation of their emotion definitions. Rather, we identified that alexithymia was linked to less precise and less well differentiated emotion definitions, though these were relatively small effects. So again, we're finding more evidence to suggest that the alexithymia hypothesis can be applied to the domain of defining emotion. But of course, we had our second research question of whether individual differences in this domain contribute to emotion recognition differences. And interestingly, again, this depended on which group we were looking at. So we identified that for autistic participants that are shown in orange here, those that have more precise emotion definitions tended to have better emotion recognition accuracy. Whereas for the non-autistic participants that are shown in green on that, you can see that there's no effect there, no relationship. For the non-autistic participants, however, the relationship was a bit more complicated. So we identified that those that had more differentiated emotion definitions tended to have more differentiated emotional experiences and in turn, higher emotion recognition accuracy. So now I just want to give a bit of an interim summary as to what I've said so far, because I appreciate there's lots of information already. So far I've said that alexithymia and not autism is linked to less precise and differentiated emotional experiences and emotion definitions, and that there seem to be maybe different mechanisms involved in autistic and non-autistic emotion recognition. So while for the autistic participants, it seems that having more precise emotion definitions is linked to better emotion recognition, in the non-autistic participants, we're seeing that those with more differentiated emotion definitions tend to have more differentiated emotional experiences, and then in turn, kind of better emotion recognition. So next, we wanted to look at this in the kind of emotion visualization domain. And specifically, we wanted to ask whether there were differences in the precision and differentiation of visual emotion representations between the autistic and non-autistic adults after controlling for alexithymia. And again, we wanted to work out whether individual differences here contribute to emotion recognition differences. And so we had participants complete our expression map paradigm, which again was developed with input from autism community members. So in this task, participants view a point-light display of an angry, happy, or sad facial expression, and they are required to manipulate a dial to change the speed of that expression until it matches what they think would be typical for that particular emotion. And they can move the dial around as much as they want, and then just press spacebar when they're satisfied. Critically, in this task, we had multiple different emotions, but we also had multiple repetitions of each of those videos. And this allowed us to index a few different things that we were interested in. So first, we could get an index of the mean speed attributed to the different emotions. But beyond that, we could also get an index of the distance between those visual emotion representations by taking an absolute difference in the speeds attributed to the different emotions. We could also get an index of the precision in those visual emotion representations, so sort of how clear that image might be. And we calculated that by taking the standard deviation of the speeds attributed to the emotional expressions across repetitions, and then we inverted that to get precision. So what did we find with respect to autism and alexithymia? Well, we actually identified something quite different. So after controlling for alexithymia, we identified that the autistic participants had more precise visual emotion representations than their non-autistic peers. So essentially, these autistic participants have what we think means sort of clearer or more repeatable or consistent images in their mind's eye of emotional facial expressions. And actually, we didn't find any role for alexithymia here. So again, we also want to think about whether individual differences in visual representations contribute to emotion recognition. And again, I sound like a broken record, but again, this depended on the group that we were looking at. So here on the graph, you can see the non-autistic participants in green. For this group, those with more precise visual emotion representations tended to have higher emotion recognition performance. However, this was not the case for the autistic participants, which are shown in grey here. So together, that paints quite an interesting picture. Although the autistic participants have more precise visual representations of emotion, this doesn't seem to be sort of contributing to their emotion recognition performance in any way. Again, suggesting some mechanistic differences in emotion recognition. But as well as looking at the relationships between our kind of emotion recognition and emotion visualizations, we also wanted to look at the relationships between the experience of emotion and the representation of emotion too. And we did identify some significant relationships, but only for the non-autistic participants again. So what we identified is that those that had more differentiated emotional experiences tended to have more differentiated visual representations. And we also identified that those with more precise emotional experiences tended to have more precise visual representations. Now, I think at first glance, it's quite tempting to think that perhaps we just found relationships between our precision variables and our distance variables because each of these have been measured in similar ways. But actually, we've measured these very differently, which gives us confidence that these are truly sort of meaningful and real relationships rather than just statistical artifacts. And also these relationships, as well as the others that I've talked about today, still hold when we control for things like self-reported effort and attention, for example. So again, just to recap, what have I said so far? Alexithymia and not autism is linked to less precise and less differentiated emotional experiences and emotion definitions, whereas autism is linked to more precise visual emotion representations, so relative strength there. I've also said that there are different mechanisms involved in autistic and non-autistic emotion recognition. So again, in the autistic sample, we're seeing that those with more precise emotion definitions tended to have higher emotion recognition, whereas for the non-autistic participant, there's a slightly more complicated model in which having more differentiated emotion definitions and emotion visualizations is linked to more differentiated emotional experiences and in turn higher emotion recognition. Similarly, having more precise emotional experiences is linked to more precise visual representations and in turn higher emotion recognition. Great. So for the last part of the talk, not the first, we're not starting again, I'm going to talk about whether there were differences in the facial expressions produced by autistic and non-autistic people after controlling for alexithymia, and then whether individual differences in this domain contribute to emotion recognition differences. So to answer these questions, we had our autistic and non-autistic adults complete our face map paradigm and our cross-neurotype emotion recognition task, which were developed again with input from community members. So in our face map paradigm, participants posed angry, happy, and sad facial expressions across two conditions. The first of those was a pose condition in which they did this along to a series of beeps. So just bear with me while I cringe and I play you an example of me doing this a few years ago. So it would be neutral on the first beep, into the expression on the second beep, and back to neutral on the third beep. And we also had a spoken condition in which participants said a standardized sentence. So my name is Joe and I'm a scientist in an angry, happy or sad way. And I will save you from the cringe of watching me do that. And I won't show you that. So we had lots of different repetitions of those emotional expressions, which meant that we had 96 recordings per participant. We used actually the front-facing iPhone camera to record those facial expressions. So essentially the sort of Face ID camera that's used to unlock your phone. And what this does is it actually projects an infrared map over your face of about 30,000 invisible dots. And that can then be used to track facial movements over time. So we recorded them with this. We then mapped the facial movements that we'd taken from that onto a common avatar face to control for differences in the shape and structure of the face across our participant sample so that we could really hone in on differences in facial movements. And then we extracted the activation of 44 different facial blend shapes, which are a bit like facial action units, if you're sort of familiar with those. And those are things like brow down left, mouth smile left, and mouth pucker, for example. So what did we find? So we identified that after controlling for alexithymia, there were significant differences in the activation of various facial features for angry, happy, and sad facial expressions between our autistic and non-autistic participants. So in these graphs to the left-hand side, you can see that there's activation on the y-axis, the facial blend shape on the x-axis, and where there's green dots, that corresponds to where there's a significant difference between the groups. I wouldn't say we should spend too much time interrogating those, but rather just look at the heat maps because it's much easier to visualize. So you can see for anger, the autistic participants were pulling down their brow to a lesser extent than their non-autistic peers. For happiness, there were sort of more numerous and larger differences, which you can see here. So the autistic participants are sort of scrunching up the upper half of their face to a lesser extent. They're also raising the corners of their mouth to a different extent and raising their cheeks a bit lesser as well. And it's quite difficult to see here, but there's also subtle differences in the kind of configuration of that mouth, the kind of shape of that mouth movement between our different groups, with the autistic participants actually activating some of those facial blend shapes more than the non-autistic participants, for example. For sadness, we also found a significant difference in which the autistic participants jutted out their lower jaw to a lesser extent than their non-autistic peers. Now, all of these results are just for the post condition, but they're very similar in the spoken condition, so I'm not going to spend any more time talking through them now. So we can say that these kind of differences seem to pertain to autism. But we did also find a role for alexithymia. So we identified that when participants were posing anger, high alexithymia was linked to more smiling, which of course is characteristic of happiness. And when posing happiness, high alexithymia was linked to more frowning and a more downturned mouth, which is much more characteristic of sadness or anger, for example. And so we ran some follow-up analyses to try to understand whether alexithymia was linked to sort of more overlapping facial expressions, and indeed that was the case. Alexithymia was linked to more overlapping angry and happy facial expressions. So in this domain, there seems to be a kind of a contribution of both autism and alexithymia to the way in which people produce emotional facial expressions. But now I want to talk a bit about whether individual differences in this domain contribute to emotion recognition differences. And before I do that, I'm going to talk about a study that was already out there at the time of us doing this work, and a really good one at that, that had looked at how well both autistic and non-autistic people could recognize both autistic and non-autistic facial expressions. So in this study, the authors found that just like how autistic people had shown difficulties recognizing non-autistic expressions in other work, the non-autistic participants also showed difficulties recognizing the autistic expressions here. So this therefore lent support to the idea that a mismatch in facial expressions might contribute to emotion recognition differences between these groups. However, it's also worth noting that the autistic participants in this study also found it more difficult to recognize the autistic facial expressions than the non-autistic facial expressions. And in this study, the authors suggested that this could be because the autistic participants were maybe producing more unique facial expressions than their non-autistic counterparts, which then may make it more difficult to recognize, or may make it more difficult for strangers to recognize those emotional facial expressions. Now, while I think this is quite plausible, in this study, the authors did not conduct any analyses to assess how unique the autistic and non-autistic facial expressions were, nor did they conduct any analyses to work out whether that kind of uniqueness contributed to those expressions being less recognizable. In this study, the authors did actually try to control for alexithymia, which was great, but unfortunately in their data, autism and alexithymia were really highly correlated and confounded, and so it made it difficult for them to determine which effects were relating to autism and which were relating to alexithymia. And so from this study, there are some remaining sort of outstanding questions. One of those questions is, are autistic expressions more unique? Another is, are dynamic autistic expressions less recognizable? And this is because in their study, they were just showing static snapshots of autistic and non-autistic facial expressions and showing those to autistic and non-autistic perceivers. And so we're not sure what the case is for dynamic facial expressions. And if these dynamic autistic expressions are less recognizable, is this due to them being more unique, or is this due to another factor, for example, high alexithymia in this group? So I'm now going to go through and answer each of these questions in turn. So in our previous study, we actually did identify that the autistic participants produced more unique facial expressions than their non-autistic peers. And we found this both on the kind of group level and also on the trait level. So together, the evidence does seem to suggest that autistic expressions may be more unique. To answer our next question of whether dynamic autistic expressions are less recognizable, we had taken the facial movements and we'd mapped them onto those avatar faces. But now what we did is we rendered videos of those avatar expressions, and then we played the videos of autistic and non-autistic people expressing those emotions back to autistic and non-autistic perceivers. So they saw the emotional facial expression, which was a bit like this one, for example. And then they had to rate how angry, happy, and sad the expression appeared. And just like before, we calculated emotion recognition accuracy as the correct emotion rating minus the mean of the two incorrect emotion ratings. So here, what I mean by that is the correct emotion rating is the emotion that they were intending to display minus the mean of the two that they were not intending to display. So what did we find? So here we identified that before controlling for alexithymia and the uniqueness of those expressions, the dynamic autistic expressions were indeed less recognizable. And actually the effects that we found were quite similar to that from the Rebecca Brewer study that I talked about previously. So you can see that for both the autistic and non-autistic perceivers, which are shown on the x-axis, they had difficulties recognizing the autistic relative to the non-autistic expressions. So it does seem to be the case that dynamic autistic expressions may be a bit less recognizable, at least to strangers. And to answer the last question, we then looked at whether adding alexithymia and expression uniqueness into the model and seeing what the effect was. And actually, when we did that, the difference in recognizability between the autistic and non-autistic poses completely disappeared. And we actually found a significant contribution or a significant relationship between how unique that expression was and how recognizable it was. So essentially, those expressions that were more unique tended to be less recognizable. And so this evidence appears to suggest that, yes, it is the case that autistic expressions may be less recognizable, but this is only due to them being a bit more unique. And something that I'd like to stress here, of course, is that this is with autistic and non-autistic strangers trying to recognize each other's emotional expressions. So it might be more difficult to recognize something that's unique. Whereas if you're interacting with your friends or your family members who have grown accustomed to the way in which you produce emotional facial expressions, then of course it's very likely that they'll still be able to recognize their emotional facial expression. So the amount that this actually can be applied to, everyday context where we're interacting with the people that we tend to be around might be slightly limited. So now I just want to recap on what I've said today. So we asked the question of whether there are differences in the precision and differentiation of emotion definitions, emotional experiences, visual representations, and facial expressions between autistic and non-autistic adults after controlling for alexithymia. And the answer is there are some differences in some cases. Specifically, what we found today is that alexithymia and not autism is linked to less precise and differentiated emotional experiences, less precise and differentiated emotion definitions, and less differentiated facial expressions. In terms of the autism side of things, we identified that autistic people actually have more precise visual motion representations, so a relative strength over their non-autistic peers. And we identified that autistic people produce different and more unique facial expressions than their non-autistic peers. So there's just differences between these groups on these factors. On top of this, I've also talked about how there are similarities and differences in the mechanisms involved in emotion recognition for autistic and non-autistic people. In terms of similarities, we've identified that for both groups, they find it harder to recognize more unique facial expressions. But in terms of differences, we see that for the autistic participants, having a more precise framework for defining emotion and having higher IQ is linked to higher emotion recognition performance, which suggests that there may be a potentially more cognitive strategy at play here. For the non-autistic participants, however, we can see that those that have more differentiated emotion definitions and emotion visualizations tend to have more differentiated emotional experiences and in turn, higher emotion recognition. For this group, we also see that those with more precise emotional experiences tend to have more precise visual representations and in turn, better emotion recognition performance. So overall, we're seeing that there do seem to be some similarities and differences in the mechanisms involved in autistic and non-autistic emotion recognition. But of course, with these models, we are not able to determine directionality and causality definitively because this was all observational in nature. But hopefully in the future, we can run some longitudinal investigations and some causal manipulation studies to work out how these factors are linked. And hopefully that will lead on to some really important implications. So on that note, I think some of this work does have some useful implications. So it does tell us which emotion processing differences are relevant to autism and which are relevant to alexithymia, which I think could be important for informing diagnosis. Our models, though clearly just in their kind of initial stages, are generating some hypotheses that we can test via those studies that I was talking about. And it might be that through that work, we can identify some sort of early abilities that we could train that might then have broad benefits for people's emotion processing and their mental health down the line. So hopefully this will pave the way for support programs to help both autistic and non-autistic people to better understand their own and other people's emotions, which we of course know is linked to mental health too. Finally, I'd just like to point to some shared materials. So I've shared the majority of the tasks I talked about today, so all of them apart from the freshly minted cross-neurotype emotion recognition task, because I'm still analysing that data and sort of sorting out that study. I've also shared lots of the data and analysis scripts. You can find those online. And we're currently making new versions of the tasks which involve full dynamic emotional expressions and all 6 basic emotions to see if we can replicate this in sort of a larger sample in a sort of broader set of emotions with more ecologically valid stimuli. So yeah, do reach out if you're interested in learning more about that. Finally, and sort of most importantly of all of the slides that I've talked about today, I want to say a huge thank you to everyone that's made this project possible. So to my supervisors, Professor Jennifer Cook and Dr. Sophie Souden Carvalho, the Cook Lab for their never-ending support during my PhD, and importantly, the lived experience experts and participants that helped us with these studies, and finally to you for listening. Yeah, I'd be grateful to take any questions. I'll just stop sharing.
Connor, thank you ever so much for a presentation that was clear and logical. It was sort of question, answer, answer, question, answer, answer, question. Beautiful. I thoroughly enjoyed it. You took from the sort of early bits of the historical idea of what autism is. You then found the issues with those historical things, looking at the double empathy problem, and from there going to expression and recognition. I love the idea of an emo map. It takes me back to my days as a goth. It was how I got places. That actually then, with all that kind of stuff, finding that there's no difference in autism. The difference in autism when it comes to the mapping, the difference is mediated by alexithymia. We have questions about that. I'll be back to them in a second. Then controlling for alexithymia and emotional language. Definitions, how we speak about our emotional inner lives, it matters. And it matters to be precise and to be understood to be precise. Again, no difference in alexithymia in the, but once you've controlled for alexithymia. I also love the speed running of emotions with that point thing where you could just go faster, slower, faster. Really clever way of doing it. Really clever way of creating the gaps which you can then measure. We've also got, I say as a bearded man, the fact that you use the iPhone, it's brilliant because these kind of things, it used to be with a video camera that I was an emotionless grey mess. I'll also say, I'll be open about this. For me, alexithymia hits 2 big emotions. For me, it's anxiety and excitement. I decided long ago just to call it all excitement. It makes life easier. Finally, you're coming across to the sort of neurogrouping and the recognition, finding that more expressions in your autistic folk, the dynamic expressions are less recognizable. I will say at that point, my brain just went, does that mean that the PNT is just not keeping up? The predominant neurotype, yeah, they need to just be a little bit faster. If there are more expressions and they're coming in faster and dynamically, that this seems like a problem with the majority rather than the minority. With that, I'm going to stop and pause the recording. There we go, pausing recording.